great pleasure and honor to host at the University of Cyprus the lecture of the Executive Director of the American Jewish Committee, Mr. David Harris. Today's lecture is an opportunity to understand how an experienced diplomat views the development in the region and to get his insights and predictions at the geopolitical and socio-political level. We will also have the opportunity to discuss and elaborate on the development partnership among Cyprus, Greece, Israel, and the United States. It is a fact that current worldwide challenges make it mandatory to strengthen the existing good relationships among our countries. The Eastern Mediterranean is destined to play a key role in enhancing peace in the region, energy security, as well as economic development. The discoveries of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean have upgraded the geostrategic position of Cyprus and have warmed the ties between our countries. However, for Cyprus to become an energy hub in the territory, it is crucial to invest in successful diplomacy and collaboration with trustworthy strategic partners. In our case, we aspire at having peace and thus prosperity in matters of social and economic welfare and a working political order that serves the true interests of all and, of course, play a key role in the overall stability in the area. It is my belief that geopolitics, technology, energy, and science will determine the future. Without doubt, successful partnerships with our allies in these areas are significant for the countries and the region's prosperity. An example of successful collaboration among our countries is the relationship established in a cultural, educational, and scientific level between the University of Cyprus and the universities and research centers in Israel, as well as the Israeli embassy in Cyprus. Moreover, the improved relationships with the embassy of the United States is a sign that our countries have a number of mutual interests to invest and build on. For decades, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East have been at the center of many historic developments. Cyprus alone is a live laboratory of geopolitical success. Current challenges in the area, the ISIS and terrorist threats, the revival of antisemitism in Europe, and the wars declared in the name of religion create new balances and facts. Facts we should examine and interpret via a constructive dialogue. What is the future of the region? What are the geopolitical shifts? What are the geopolitical gains? What are the geographical shifts? Are these shifts temporary or do they have a more permanent nature? What role will the United States play in the area? What is the role of Turkey and Egypt in the region? These are some of the main questions and concerns crossing my mind. And Mr. Harris, we really look forward to your analysis. Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure to be here at the university, and as you know, I do my best in order to find an excuse to come here to the university, and today's event is an excellent one. Thank you very much for that. As you mentioned, Kostas, Director, that in the recent few years, we as embassy, we did invest a lot of time and energy and resources in order to strengthen and deepen our relations, especially in the fields of education and culture, believing that this is the best way to deepen our relations between our two countries. You know, our region basically produces a lot of challenges, I suppose, interesting ones. I'm not going to, of course, to list all of them, but for a challenger, one of the most positive, let's say, challenges, developments, is the relations between Cyprus and Israel. And I'm very happy that both governments really took advantage of the given opportunities and went ahead with our relations. We shouldn't take it for granted. We should invest more and more in order to deepen our relations, and I believe that our two countries, two governments, and two peoples are very much keen to do it. I think it is very much important to hear a perspective from out of the region, and I think David is the best one to share with us this perspective, please bear in mind, maybe just a small tip, that here in Cyprus and in a bit of maybe similar in Israel, we are convinced that this is the center of the world. So bear it in mind. Thank you.
Good evening, Erev Tov. To the rector of the university, thank you for the invitation to the University of Cyprus. To be in the presence of my friend, the former foreign minister, you honor us, you honor me by being here, Erato. To be with the distinguished ambassadors, to be flanked by the distinguished ambassadors of Israel, my friend Michael Harari, and my new friend, the ambassador of Bulgaria. To be here with several members of the American Jewish Committee delegation, and to be with all of you, deans, faculty, and students here. Please accept my heartfelt thanks for the Greek word is what? Xenia? So thank you. I need to tell you firstly that I would normally wear a tie, so this is not an expression of sympathy for the new Prime Minister of Greece. Rather, it's the simple fact that we began this morning in Kiev with a very heavy snowstorm that raised doubts about whether we would arrive in Nicosia. We did arrive, but 3 hours late, and with no opportunity to change and put on a tie and jacket. So please do not read any political interpretations into this. And I must say, this morning when we looked out the window in Kiev, I had my doubts that we would be here this afternoon. But Debbie Seidhoff, who was here, Candy Gould, Nati Seidhoff, Joey Resnick, and the others who couldn't make it to the university this afternoon but are in Nicosia, are all thrilled to be here. My story begins in the 1980s, and I want to look back before I look forward, if you'll permit me. In the 1980s, what you, professors, said was not so obvious. In the 1980s, there were a few Hellenic American leaders and a few American Jewish representatives who had become friendly in Chicago and New York and other cities where both communities lived. And so friendly, in fact, that we found it unnatural to see that same friendship lacking in the triangle among Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. What was it that we had in America that didn't exist here? And so, working together as non-governmental organizations and with the help of several officials like Paul Sarbanes, who was for many years the distinguished senator of Hellenic origin from the state of Maryland, and others, we set out to see whether we could help visualize with our friends in Greece, Cyprus, and Israel a different paradigm. Now, please understand, in those days, it wasn't so simple. In Athens, you had the government of Andreas Papandreou, the father, so to speak, who in those years was a problem child for much of Western Europe. His orientation was very much to Moscow and the Arab world, to a very large degree. So much so that in 1982, Mike, after Israel's incursion into Lebanon and the defeat of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, angry at other Arabs for not having supported him sufficiently, first came to Athens in order to find Xenia. I remember our first meetings with Andreas Papandreou in Athens and New York, and they were not easy meetings. Always respectful, but not easy, which is a diplomatic way of saying They were very, very tough. And he would tell us, my friends, you don't understand, Mr. Assad in Syria, Mr. Gaddafi in Libya, Mr. Arafat are not your enemies. To which we would say, if they're not our enemies, they're certainly making a very good appearance of looking like our enemies. And so that was the situation in Greece, just to sum it up. And in Cyprus, again, if I may summarize, obviously a much more complex situation. Cyprus was so attached to the notion of the non-aligned movement and so sensitive to any issue that could affect its own strategic assumptions about the divided island and how it would play out in the multilateral sphere, that it was hesitant, at least as I understood it, we understood it, to go out too far in engaging with Israel. But we persisted, believing in this triangle and ultimately believing in this quadrilateral relationship that included the United States. Today, it seems quite obvious, but then it wasn't. And maybe if you'll allow me to insert for the students in the room a small kind of parable. If you don't think big and dream big when you're young, you won't act big and realize big things when you're old. So just as I'm a great believer, and I'll come to it later, in the European Union and those who fought and acted big after the Second World War, so too, this group sought to think big when it seemed almost impossible. And today, for reasons we can discuss, that quadrilateral relationship is basically in place with work to be done, obviously. But when you speak today about the close cooperation and the mutually beneficial cooperation between Cyprus and Israel, for example, the ties between this university and Israeli universities, the faculty here who have studied in Israeli universities, the exchanges back and forth, it almost seems as if it were natural. In fact, those in our delegation here for the first time, including Mr. Saidov, who was born in Israel, look out the window and say, my goodness, if I didn't know, this could be Israel. The topography, the architecture, the soul, if you will, of this crossroads of the Eastern Mediterranean. And with Greece, at least until a couple of weeks ago, I could say that we had made enormous progress as well. Today, I can only ask questions. And the first question, of course, is, will the new Prime Minister and his new coalition government drive their foreign policy based principally on pragmatism or ideology? And by the way, we're not the only ones asking that question. There are a few people we know in Brussels and elsewhere who are asking the very same question. A few people in the IMF, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, the German Finance Ministry, and I can go down a longer list, who are asking the very same question. Which is it? Is it ideology or is it pragmatism? If it's pragmatism, we may or may not initially agree, but we'll find a deal. If it's ideology, we've got some very challenging times ahead for us. And not just on Eurozone issues, but on foreign policy questions as well, including the country I just came from, Ukraine. And allow me a small detour. On this journey, we have now been in 3 countries in a row, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and Cyprus, which have at least one important geopolitical phenomenon in common. And that is that in each case, there are issues of external occupation. And in each of the 3 countries, in our discussions, first in Baku, with President Aliyev, and with Foreign Minister Mamedyarov, and then in Kiev, with Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, and with Foreign Minister Klimkin and others, and I'm sure tomorrow in our meetings with the President Anastasiadis and Foreign Minister Kassoulidis and others, these questions of occupation will dominate a good part of the discussion, as they must. And so I'm happy in the discussion period as well to talk about the common themes, but I can assure you that in Kiev, one of the central questions is regarding Mr. Tsipras. What posture will he take within the European Union, within the FAC, with respect to EU measures against Russia? And I know as well that for Cyprus, that is not an unimportant question either, for obvious reasons too. Earlier in this journey, I should add, we were in France, Italy, and Poland. Poland, because it was the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and Birkenau, and it was obviously a powerful moment, impressive to see so many world leaders who were there, and the sense of solidarity and commitment. In France, we were there just after the Je suis Charlie, Je suis Juif, Je suis policier events earlier in January, and a major discussion in the government about what to do next. And again, I'm happy to return to these themes in the discussion. I simply want you to understand the context for this particular visit. But coming back to Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean, just as we had a vision in the 1980s, we have a vision in the year 2015. And it's not a vision that we alone have. It's a vision that I know Foreign Minister Kassoulidis has, and when Erato was his predecessor, we had similar discussions, and that is whether we can, over time, visualize an entirely different architecture of the Eastern Mediterranean, and not accept the fact that the status quo today is the status quo forever. That would be small-minded thinking. That would be an injustice to the young people in this room and to future generations. And here I draw my inspiration from another group of people. I hinted at it a moment ago. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, 60 million or more people dead, murdered. Tens of millions exiled and homeless. 6 million Jews, 2/3 of European Jewry destroyed, in an entirely new alphabet of murder, from A for Auschwitz to Z for Zyklon B. The French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, turned to his aide, Jean Monnet, and said, I have an assignment for you. It's not a small assignment. I want you to think about alternative models for Europe that will prevent future aggression from Germany. After all, depending on how you count, and they did not count the Napoleonic War, they began in 1870 with 3 invasions by Germany on French territory. And so Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, joined subsequently by people like Paul-Henri Spaak of Belgium, Alcide de Gasperi of Italy, encouraged by people like President Dwight Eisenhower in the United States, encouraged by Winston Churchill, who as early as 1946, in his famous Zurich speech, had spoken about a United States of Europe, his term. They came together and they created the beginning of an architecture whose ultimate goal was to prevent future war on the European continent, and particularly German aggression against France. And what did it begin with? It began, you might think, very unambitiously, with 6 countries, not 28, and 2 products, or 2 commodities, coal and steel. But the story was never really about coal and steel alone. It was about creating a new architecture, a new interdependence among the core countries France, Germany, Italy, and the 3 Benelux countries that would create a prosperous and peaceful alternative to the cycles of war and violence and destruction. And they succeeded. And by 1957, the Treaty of Rome was signed. And then you can walk your way through from there until today, the 28, the Eurozone, and the rest. And the part that troubles me, especially for the younger generation in Europe, is that too many may not fully appreciate what Europe has achieved. Instead, Europe today is cynically or skeptically seen by many as a Eurozone crisis, as a bureaucratization in Brussels that focuses on standardization of light bulbs and interferes in the lives of many without any accountability. I think it's a huge mistake. I don't for a moment underestimate the challenges within Europe, especially the Eurozone, including right here and neighboring Greece. But for me, and I hope for you, the larger success of the vision of Europe is not about standardization of light bulbs. Not even close. It's about creating the most ambitious and successful peace project in modern history. That's what Europe has achieved, beginning with the 6, and then moving in the 1970s to embrace Greece, Portugal, and Spain, but only, and again the point, only after they abandoned their period of fascism, their period of military or quasi-military or authoritarian rule. Only then were they admitted into the democratic club of the EU. Or take the post-communist societies, including Bulgaria and neighboring Romania. That this Europe has been able to absorb the post-fascist societies, the post-communist societies, again, not easily. But then if one understands the challenge, it makes more sense. So I stand before you as a committed Europeanist who absolutely believes that whatever the crisis of the day may be, and I understand there are big crises, that what Europe has achieved is also a model for other parts of the world. And that includes, perhaps, one day, the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, this being a university, the first instinct of many will probably be, as it was for me, when I was an undergraduate, and then a graduate, and then a lecturer. Well, what's wrong with what he's saying? How can I find the difficulty, the problem in what he's saying? And I'll be the first to admit there are many problems and difficulties in what I'm saying. But it should not divert us from the larger vision that we need. The vision that Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet brought after the war. The vision that some in the 1980s brought to this triangle. To say, can the Eastern Mediterranean look different? And with Jonas Kassoulidis, the foreign minister of Cyprus, for example, we've had discussions, such as, what about replacing coal and steel with energy and electricity? And beginning to visualize countries in this part of the world. And I'll be ambitious, not today, but in 10 years, 20 years, which in the scheme of history is a grain of sand. What about one day energy and electricity links that connect not just Israel and Greece, thankfully that's happening, and not just Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, which we hope will happen, and not just now perhaps Israel and Jordan and Israel and Egypt, but what about Egypt, the state of Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, a united island of Cyprus, Greece, and perhaps one day other countries beyond that first tier in the Levant. Is that completely inconceivable? Well, today I would say yes. Tomorrow, I refuse to say yes. It's inconceivable. Because to say it's inconceivable tomorrow and the day after is to abandon all hope. And Dante may have said to those who entered Inferno, lasciate ogni speranza o voi che entrate, leave behind any hope, those of you who enter. I refuse to leave behind any hope when entering the University of Cyprus or returning to my day job at the American Jewish Committee. Our job, it seems to me, governmental and non-governmental diplomats and policy planners and public intellectuals, is to offer alternative visions, big ideas. And I think this is one. And I think it's potentially doable. And it begins with Israel and Cyprus, and then we connect Greece, and then we move on to Egypt and Jordan, the most likely candidates, and we build. And a second big idea for the Eastern Mediterranean, and particularly for Israel, a country central to the concerns of AJC, and that is building peace. Building peace both around energy and electricity, but also around the notion that we owe the children of the Middle East a better alternative to the history that has predated them. And I would like to think, and again, there's only a glimmer of hope, but I'll grab it, a glimmer of hope that in the new understanding of the Middle East, there is a recognition that there may be new blocks being formed, new ways of looking at the region. Egypt and Israel today have far more in common than divides them, by far. Israel and Jordan have far more in common today than that which divides them. Now that may not be big news, but I would submit that perhaps Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and Kuwait, Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Israel and Oman may have far more in common than they, not we, but they will admit. And that offers, it seems to me, a potential new opening as well that needs to be very carefully explored. Again, nothing happens overnight in the Middle East, or if it happens overnight in the Middle East, it's not usually positive. So I'm overcoming the American and Israeli and Jewish instinct to want to repair everything today. And it's difficult to resist the temptation. But is it not possible that for those in Riyadh, for example, the new leadership, or shall I say the new old leadership, or in Kuwait or elsewhere, they have certain new understandings of the world. Will they admit it? Depends who they're speaking to. But number one, who's their enemy today? Israel? Does Israel threaten Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates? Does Israel threaten Egypt and Jordan? Does it threaten Morocco and Tunisia? It never has, and it certainly doesn't today. Nor will it, I believe, Ambassador Harari, tomorrow. Not at all, to the contrary. But who does threaten them? Well, the growing arc of instability. The arc of instability that begins, on the one hand, with Iran, and the Shiite arc that has been cultivated from Tehran, Iraq, Yemen of late, Syria with all of its turmoil, Lebanon with Hezbollah just across the pond, if you will, from where we sit. It's pretty powerful. It's pretty threatening if I'm the king of Saudi Arabia. And especially if the head of that snake gets nuclear capability that is confirmed by the international community as its right. Not nuclear weapons, but nuclear capability. Breakout, threshold capability. I'm nervous if I'm the king of Saudi Arabia. Now, who have I depended on for my umbrella security? Well, above all, I've depended on the United States for my umbrella security, haven't I? But then again, I was more important to the United States 2 years ago than I am today. And that's because of another game changer, one that we've been dreaming about since 1973 at AJC, and that was American energy independence. Well, it's now happening before our eyes. That's a big one. And what it means, among other things, is enormous national security, geopolitical, and economic benefits for the United States if we play our cards right. Just as it will mean the same, I hope, for Israel and Cyprus if you play your cards right. But it also means, perhaps, a slightly diminished interest in defending other oil producers in this region if the cost is higher than it was. So, I offer the provocative thought that if I'm the king of Saudi Arabia, and I will admit, that's quite a leap for David Harris of the American Jewish Committee to try and put himself in the shoes of the king of Saudi Arabia. But I'm not sure where my security umbrella comes from. But I do know one thing that operates in this part of the world. The enemy of my enemy may not be my closest friend, but is at least my acquaintance. Well, the enemy of my enemy happens to be the State of Israel. And the State of Israel happens to have a formidable security establishment. And Israel is not leading the region. Even if it is energy independent, it's not leading the region. It might wish to. It can't. Many things you can change in life. You can't change geography. And so, as I look ahead, is it possible that with deft, creative, persistent, quiet diplomacy, we can begin to think about new configurations in the Middle East, in which Israel increasingly seen as part of the solution by its neighbors, and not part of the problem in the sense that it's always used as the excuse for other issues going on. I have another, I sound like Martin Luther King in a way, I have another dream, another vision, which I think will work to the benefit of the Eastern Mediterranean, and you're at the opening to that Eastern Mediterranean, so what happens around affects you very directly. I have a dream that there will be more leaders like Anwar Sadat, the late leader of Egypt, who in 1977, having previously been the Egyptian chief of staff, who fought Israel in war, who during the Second World War was sympathetic to the Nazi regime in Berlin, did not suddenly wake up as a Zionist. That would be asking too much. But who suddenly wake up and said, no more war. The goal of the exercise is no longer the destruction of Israel, it's the construction of Egypt. More Arab leaders who begin to focus on construction rather than destruction could also transform the region, and I urge you, if you haven't already done so, read the United Nations-sponsored Arab Human Development Report. These are not talking points of AJC or the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Read the United Nations-sponsored Arab Human Development Report, and what you'll see there is a very rare and sobering admission by Arab scholars who wrote the report that there are 3 profound deficits in the Arab world. And they are enduring, and they are endemic, and they are systemic, and they are structural. And unless others begin to grapple with this understanding, then we will be faced with more Syrias and more Yemens and more Libyas right at the doorstep of Israel and Cyprus. Deficit number 1, the democracy deficit. Where exactly is it that we have democracy as you and we understand it in this part of the world? And I don't mean the democracy that brought Hamas to power in Gaza. As we say, one ballot, one time. I mean the democracy that includes free and fair elections, smooth transfers of power, an independent judiciary, civilian control of the military, and a robust civil society as a mediating force between the government and the governed. That's what I'm talking about as democracy. And not people going simply one time and saying, Hamas, you're now in power, here are the keys, end of story. That's not democracy. And I think, if I can be self-critical, and we said so at the time, it was one of the biggest mistakes made by the previous administration in Washington. Every administration makes mistakes. This was one of their biggest. Ignoring Egypt, ignoring the Palestinian Authority, ignoring Israel, and insisting that Hamas be allowed to play in a democratic election as an anti-democratic force. So the democracy deficit is one. The gender deficit is the second of the three deficits. What the report says that in some countries up to 50% of the human capital of the country are essentially disenfranchised. They're not in the workforce, or if they are, they're segregated. They're at the bottom, not the top. And unless and until you can unleash the power of the human capital of all your citizens, male and female, you'll never reach the full potential of society. And number three, the knowledge deficit. If you read the report, and I have some of the statistics, but I won't take them out now because you'll think I'm checking my emails. But if you read the statistics, they're devastating. They're devastating. Nobel Prizes, patents, startups, books translated from foreign languages into Arabic in order to bring knowledge. Spain alone, as I recall, translates more books into Spanish in 1 year than all 22 Arab countries have done in the last several centuries. There are stunning statistics. In 1950, Egypt and China, as I recall, had more or less similar numbers of engineers. The GDP of Egypt and South Korea in 1950 was essentially identical. Now compare South Korea to Egypt. Compare the number of engineers in China to Egypt. Compare the number of patents in Israel per 100,000 to neighboring countries. Compare the number of Israeli startups on NASDAQ to the rest of the world. But too many, for expedient political reasons, have failed to address the structural and systemic issues in this part of the world. And then ask, why did the Arab Spring blossom? And the answer, and it's one that we gave at the time in the New York Times, and people said, no, but AJC is probably just, using talking points. It wasn't talking points. What we were trying to express was the Arab Spring is about more than one event for 1 month or 1 year. Unless and until you have courageous leaders of these countries who dig deep into the problems of the countries and begin to create a new pathway, Libya will be Libya, and Syria will be Syria, and Yemen will be Yemen, and the instability whose tremors are felt as far and as near as Cyprus, not to mention Israel, will continue. So our big vision thinking is about not just continuing to maintain and strengthen the quadrilateral relations that have been built among the United States, Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, which now have new questions because of recent developments in Athens, but we will persist and I trust prevail, because this is not a gift to any country. This is about enlightened, mutual benefits to each of the countries. And we will push with our friends on alternative visions for electricity and energy in this part of the world. And we're going to push on helping those Arab countries who begin to understand that Israel is not the problem, Israel is one of the vehicles to the solution, which includes not just energy and not just electricity, but peace, 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 peace as the object of the exercise. France and Germany? Is there a border today? There is no border. My children who loved to get stamps in their passports when they were young were always frustrated. There's no border. Common currency. Some see the common currency as what suffocated their economies. I must admit, when I think common currency, the first thing I think is no more war between France and Germany. So these things are possible. A revolution in the Arab world, which is not just the spring, but is a true revolution that goes deep, deep into the deficits and begins to overcome them for the benefit of the people themselves and ultimately for the region, is what it's about. Finally, this is because I'm a great believer, I always have been, in a word introduced to the world in the Greek language: democracy. Democracy is, to me, not the surefire answer, but the best possible answer to the cycles of war. By and large, with few exceptions, democratic nations do not wage war against other democratic nations. You'll find examples, but very few in history. And so when you look at the situations that we're dealing with, too often they are situations that involve democratic and quasi or non-democratic nations. So to me, what Cyprus has achieved, what Israel has achieved, what Greece has achieved, what the EU has achieved, what North America has achieved, I can go down a longer list, is the best chance we have, the best chance we have to create the arc of stability and replace the arc of instability. To ensure as well that Auschwitz will always be a memory of the past, but never a prospect for the future. That's the essence of democracy. And that's why we attach so much importance in our big visioning in this part of the world to true democracy. Not democracy as a slogan, but the democracy I described. The democracy that's practiced here in Nicosia. The democracy that's practiced in Jerusalem. At times messy, yes. At times imperfect, yes. But what did Churchill say? My hero, Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government known to man, except for every other. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.